Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to Other Minds and Hands, now at our new time for those who are joining us live. We are on Monday afternoon/evening now. So thanks, everybody, for joining us. Today, we continue our openings series as we continue to do some close comparison of source texts and adaptations and looking at different adaptations and seeing what patterns we can see and how they handle things, some of the kinds of similarities and differences to highlight the choices that are being made in the adaptations. We've done 2 instances of this already. We've done some comparisons of the openings of The Hobbit and of The Fellowship of the Ring. And today we are shifting from Tolkien and doing something that Maggie and I have threatened to do many times over the last year, and that is discuss Jane Austen. So today we're going to do Pride and Prejudice.
I feel like we're doing the most contained version we could do, though. Like the first
Yes.
2 minutes of each adaptation, the first chapter of the text, it's like, all right, let's just dip that toe in and see how we go.
Exactly it.
Yeah.
Exactly it. Yeah, yeah.
We both love it, but we haven't talked about it in detail to each other. So I just think it'll be interesting to see where this goes.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, yes. Okay. So we're going to look at the opening of chapter 1. So, of course, the opening of the first sentence of Pride and Prejudice, one of the most famous opening sentences in all of literature. I'm also not actually, I'm less confident about where to end the opening because she jumps straight into dialogue, right? Which is a very different approach than we saw Tolkien take in either of his texts.
Yeah. I think we might have to just carry it through to like the first establishing scene, right? Because that first exchange of dialogue is pretty important, and it does compare pretty strongly to the 2 film adaptations we're going to look at. So I think it's probably worth looking at that first transition.
Agreed. Okay, so we begin, of course, with the famous first sentence. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. However little known the feelings or views of such a man may be on his first entering a neighborhood, this truth is so well fixed in the minds of the surrounding families that he is considered the rightful property of some one or other of their daughters. "My dear Mr. Bennet," said his lady to him one day, "have you heard that Netherfield Park is let at last?" Actually, do you want to talk about the openings before we get to the dialogue? We should probably do that. Let's kind of separate, just like we were kind of doing a paragraph at a time.
Okay, yeah.
With Tolkien, let's kind of start here. Okay,
and especially because these 2, like you said, that first line is probably the best known ever. That second paragraph should be one of the best known ever. Because, like, man, that says a lot. That says a lot in a short amount of time.
It really does. It really does. So, one of the things that we can clearly see, which is less clear from the first paragraph, is that we are being told the perspective from which, like the point of view from which this whole story is going to be taking place, right? This is clearly not going to be a story told from the point of view of the man, a single man in possession of a good fortune, right? The single man in possession of good fortune is clearly established by this second sentence as like the object, not the subject of the story, right? However little known the feelings or views of such a man, this sort of it's slightly dismissive, right? Like, we don't really care about who he is. We don't care about
such a man,
what he thinks, whatever. Like, of such a man. This truth is so well fixed in the minds of the surrounding families that he is considered the rightful property of some one or other of their daughters. Yeah. So again, like, the surrounding families without, having used only 2 sentences, we get this clear perspective, right? We are plainly invested in the point of view of the surrounding families when a single man in possession of good fortune arrives.
Yeah, the bit I love about that is that geographic element. It's when a man of good fortune arrives to this area and the surrounding families are immediately affected because they see this as their potential property. Like, that whole idea in one sentence just paints such a strong picture of what that is. So like that sets the setting for us. And I feel like that's what's interesting when we look at the adaptations of just like setting, setting, setting. This is a very different establishment of setting than what we get in
Absolutely.
the films.
Absolutely. Yes. And of course we also get the plot setting in this sentence as well. Right? We haven't been told anything specific yet about any of the characters or any of the action, right? And yet it is clear that the context of the opening of this book is a single man in possession of a good fortune, first entering a neighborhood with surrounding families whose daughter consider him the right, who consider him the rightful property of someone or other of their daughters, right? Yeah. So it's easy to say on the one hand we're told nothing about the plot or the characters, but then
And yet
actually we're told almost everything about the plot and the characters.
And we're very clear on what the expectation is and what we should see the outcome being, right?
Yes.
Like, oh, rich man needs a wife. That is my expectation. Like foundations laid, got it.
Yes. And the whole the sort of the impersonal tone of this, from the way that the man's the way the man is depersonalized, right? And the way in which his feelings or views are explicitly disregarded in the second sentence, right?
He's unimportant. Yeah.
Yeah. It really shows, it really helps us to understand the whole cultural pressure from the start, right? It sets a fascinating tone because it shows how it prepares us for the context that this is not, or not to be assumed to be, a romance in some senses, right?
It's a transaction / lottery, because it certainly doesn't sound like we care about the match either. It's just many families with daughters. It doesn't matter who she is,
Right. Doesn't matter who she is. Doesn't matter who he is. Doesn't matter what they think or feel about each other. Again, his feelings explicitly disregarded. Her feelings, that is the feelings of the daughters, not even addressed.
Oh, right? No, they're just transactional. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's and the transaction is family based, right? The surrounding families consider the single man in possession of a good fortune the rightful property of their daughters, right? So the financial, the transaction is financial. The transaction is social in the sense of being family related, though notice his being of good family is not presented as a qualification in the first sentence.
He just needs to be rich.
He just needs to be rich. Exactly. Yeah. So like there's a kind of, one of the things that makes this first sentence so famous is there's something really just sort of boldly honest about this first sentence as a tone setter for the entire book, right? We're going to just say right up front, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how they feel about each other. It doesn't matter what his other characteristics or merits or demerits might be. Is he of good family? Is he a good person? Right? I mean, is he horrible? And gonna treat her well or badly? Doesn't matter.
They don't care. Did you hear that Netherfell Park has let it last? They don't care by who. He's got 4,000 to 5,000 a year. That's all that matters.
Right. They don't hire a PI. They don't. It's all they need to know is how much money he makes. And that's of course it's not. This is not like a summary of the whole book. This is the starting point, right?
Yeah.
And so it is made very clear. And of course, it would have been, if we think of, one thing that's interesting to do, though kind of challenging to do, is to sort of compare and contrast the impact that these first two sentences have on contemporary readers compared to modern readers.
Totally, right? Yeah.
To us...
What year is this? 1830, 1840?
No, earlier. I'm forgetting. Somebody look it up for me. I forget. But it's it's set in like the 18. But no, I think it's like first first or second decade. It's early
Okay.
in the 19th century. But 1813. Thank you.
Thanks, Phil.
Thank you, Phil. And was written at about that time, and that is, there's some. Northanger Abbey was the first novel written by Jane Austen, though it wasn't published until afterwards. It was not the first novel published, though it was the first one that was written. But that was the Northanger Abbey, I think, is the only one that was like seriously out of sequence. But it seems to be set a few years earlier, perhaps, but around that period. So it's really people will sometimes call Jane Austen, will lump her in with Victorian novelists, but she's decades before the Victorians. She's really closer to an 18th century sensibility in a lot of ways. It was really fun. When I was in college, I was sort of introduced to Jane Austen in a class on Fielding in Austen, Henry Fielding, one of the first novelists in the 18th century. So we read Joseph Andrews and Tom Jones, and then we read a bunch of Austen after that. So kind of understanding her in that 18th century context was really interesting, because by the time we get to the Victorian era, a whole bunch of things are changing socially, and it creates a totally different environment. If you read something like Vanity Fair, for instance, you can see some of the very different social environment of the mid 19th century compared to the very early 19th century. But anyway, to a modern reader, right, this is an important recalibration. It basically is if we're sensitive to the signal that these first two sentences give us, the signal is clearly chuck out all of your expectations and assumptions about the circumstances in which two people choose to get married and how relationships are supposed to work, right? It clearly declares all of the social presumptions about weddings and about marriage. For the contemporary audience, right? For the audience in 1813, you think about what this does there. What this does is say flatly out loud something everybody kind of knew, but nobody really
maybe didn't actually own
aloud.
Up to, right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. I mean, everybody knows that the money is what's most important,
but it would be crass if you pointed that out, and that would reflect poorly on you, which would probably be demerit number one in this community.
Exactly. You're supposed in theory to care very much about his character and his family, and is he a good person, and are the two of them a good match, will she make him a good wife and her a good husband. These are things you're supposed to be thinking about, and there's, in most cases, at least a sort of lip service for that. But this is, I won't say it's shocking, but it's bold. It's bold to Austen declares this, in a sense, to be a work of satire from the very first sentence, right? That she is exposing, and slightly comedically exposing.
It feels very tongue-in-cheek. Did you know? Yeah.
Right. Yes. So Nameless Arcanum, I wouldn't say that it's subversive any more than, again, so thinking of satire, I mean, we have several sort of obvious and widespread, well-known instances of satire in our culture now. Things like Saturday Night Live is often, is satire. A lot of the sort of comedy news broadcasts, there's satire of cable news. The Onion, of course, is sort of classic satire. And if you think about those, are they subversive? Well, yeah, satire is always subversive a little bit, right? Yeah. But that's not to say they're necessarily trying to
completely anti. Yeah.
completely anti, and like to undermine and overthrow everything. What this is doing is, again, it's pointing out a thing that everybody, a way in which everybody acts, but which everybody doesn't always say. Again, and that's what is being explicitly pointed to in the opening phrase. It is a truth universally acknowledged, right? Everybody believes this. Everybody thinks this way. Whenever a single rich man, whenever there is a single rich man, it is a truth universally acknowledged that he must be in want of a wife. The sentence claims to be about the man, right? But of course, it's actually indirectly about women and the families of women, right? And it is acknowledged. The truth that's really being universally acknowledged is that marriageable single women and families of marriageable single women are going to throw themselves and their daughters at single men in possession of good fortune. And you can always expect this to happen.
Right.
So there's a lot that's being sort of satirized there.
But I think that's also kind of the purpose, because it's setting up that expectation that it is just transactional. So when emotion enters into these relationships in the text, it hits that much harder, because they do talk about,
Yes.
Jane wants to marry for love, and
Yes.
there is a love between Mr. and Mrs. Bennet and things like that. So you do see emotion, you do see love and attraction, but it's not the norm. It's not the given. You're not guaranteed to have it. Charlotte Lucas, right,
exactly.
There are some matches in the text that are purely transactional, but our expectation is to not have that, which I think is what makes it such a satisfying romance, because I'm not expecting it. So then when you get it, you're like, oh, that's lovely.
Right. And there's a lot of openness to kind of examining that on both sides, the ways in which the kind of tensions between the actual what is called out there, how we're little on the feelings or views, right? Both of those things, the feelings and views of potential marriage partners are very much going to be the subject of this book, right? And different people are going to have different feelings and views. Views here being, so feelings, just their emotions, whether or not they're attracted to the person, whether they want to marry them. But views also, whether they be views about marriage and what marriage should be and how that should work in general, whether it should be, you might have feelings, you might be attracted to somebody but have the view that they would not be smart to marry them, right? Because they're not a good fit, not even just for financial reasons, but for other reasons too. Like, you might be attracted to somebody who does not have a good character, or who you suspect, might not have a good character in one way or another. Like, they might be unpleasant and horrible. They might be actually corrupt, like that. So your assessment of them could, factor into your views on the situation. These things which are being so casually dismissed here. Again, they're all in every marriage that happens, every marriage that gets brokered during the course of this book. The feelings and views are always interesting and always important. But it's set against this initial establishment of the presumption is none of that matters, right? And so we're prepared for the pushback, right? Which we'll get, like when there are people, when there are girls who are being set up to marry rich men, or to pursue anyway rich men, and are not interested in doing so, they're going to receive a lot of pressure, despite to overcome or ignore their feelings or views, right? In order to do this. So anyway, establishing this this kind of baseline. Again, it doesn't mean this is how all of the book is going to go, but it does place this very firmly as the number one kind of expectation to be kind of dealt with. It really places the question of where it's where the framework is, sort of.
I'm tempted to start tying this into the films. I don't know if you find it too early or if we should.
Well, let's go on to the dialogue next, and then we can move into the films. Okay, yeah. So we jump straight into dialogue. Notice we get no introduction. Like Mr. and Mrs. Bennet lived in. We don't get any of that, right? We just leap into. We don't even know at the beginning of the quotation who is speaking, right? "My dear Mr. Bennet," said his lady to him one day, "have you heard that Netherfield Park has let at last?" Mr. Bennet replied that he had not. "But it is," returned she, "for Mrs. Long has just been here, and she told me all about it." Mr. Bennet made no answer. "Do you not want to know who has taken it?" cried his wife impatiently.
I love this bit.
Me too. "You want to tell me, and I have no objection to hearing it." This was invitation enough. "Why, my dear, you must know. Mrs. Long says that Netherfield is taken by a young man of large fortune from the north of England, that he came down on Monday in a chaise and four to see the place, and was so much delighted with it, that he agreed with Mr. Morris immediately, that he is to take possession before Michaelmas, and some of his servants are to be in the house by the end of next week." "What is his name?" "Bingley." "Is he married or single?" "Oh, single, my dear, to be sure. A single man of large fortune, 4,000 or 5,000 a year. What a fine thing for our girls!" "How so? How can it affect them?" "My dear Mr. Bennet," replied his wife, "how can you be so tiresome? You must know that I am thinking of his marrying one of them." "Is that his design in settling here?" "Design? Nonsense! How can you talk so? But it is very likely that he may fall in love with one of them, and therefore you must visit him as soon as he comes." "I see no occasion for that. You and the girls may go, or you may send them by themselves, which perhaps will be still better, for as you are as handsome as any of them, Mr. Bingley may like you best of the party." I probably shouldn't read like the whole chapter, but though it's tempting.
Short chapter, just keep going.
It's a short chapter. Okay, I will keep going. All right.
It's real fun. And just, we can't assume that everyone here is the same way about Pride and Prejudice as they are about Lord of the Rings. So,
right. Right.
Oh, sorry, my camera keeps freezing, but I'm still here.
Okay, all right. We'll keep going then. "My dear, you flatter me. I certainly have had my share of beauty, but I do not pretend to be anything extraordinary now. When a woman has 5 grown-up daughters, she ought to give over thinking of her own beauty. In such cases, a woman has not often much beauty to think of. But, my dear, you must indeed go and see Mr. Bingley when he comes into the neighborhood. It is more than I engage for, I assure you." "But consider your daughters. Only think what an establishment it would be for one of them. Sir William and Lady Lucas are determined to go merely on that account, for in general, they visit no newcomers. Indeed, you must go, for it will be impossible for us to visit him if you do not." "You are over-scrupulous, surely. I dare say Mr. Bingley will be very glad to see you, and I will send a few lines by you to assure him of my hearty consent to his marrying whichever he chooses of the girls, though I must throw in a good word for my little Lizzie." "I desire you will do no such thing. Lizzie is not a bit better than the others, and I am sure she is not half so handsome as Jane, nor half so good-humoured as Lydia, but you are always giving her the preference." "They have none of them much to recommend them," replied he. "They are all silly and ignorant like other girls, but Lizzie has something more of quickness than her sisters." "Mr. Bennet, how can you abuse your own children in such a way? You take delight in vexing me. You have no compassion for my poor nerves." "You mistake me, my dear. I have a high respect for your nerves. They are my old friends. I have heard you mention them with consideration these last 20 years at least. Ah, you do not know what I suffer. But I hope you will get over it, and live to see many young men of 4,000 a year come into the neighborhood. It will be of no use to us if 20 such should come, since you will not visit them. Depend upon it, my dear, when there are 20, I will visit them all." Mr. Bennet was so odd a mixture of quick parts, sarcastic humour, reserve, and caprice, that the experience of 23 years had been insufficient to make his wife understand his character. Her mind was less difficult to develop. She was a woman of mean understanding, little information, and uncertain temper. When she was discontented, she fancied herself nervous. The business of her life was to get her daughters married. Its solace was visiting and news. All right, there we go.
Well, she was a woman of mean understanding, little information, and uncertain temper.
So it would be an awesome business card.
Yeah, right. It's going to be my subline on LinkedIn now.
Yeah, exactly. Actually, that would be a really good description, like a profile description on social media. It'd be
Okay. I
phenomenal.
don't think it actually fits me, but I feel like those that get it would get me.
Yes,
So, yeah.
yes. Um, uh, actually, that's very,
Anyway,
very
I
cool.
do think all of that was important purely because it sets the stage of what the text really focuses on. And it's this quick dialogue, this witty, pay attention to the words, because everything is trying to tell you something and everything is part of world building.
Yes,
Like, so
yes.
much is established in that relationship, in that household dynamic, in that community structure, in social mores. Like, we just had so many clues in that
There's,
lovely
yeah,
back and forth.
absolutely. There are like many levels of things that we can see or conclude by careful reading of this paragraph. Everything from like the purely superficial, which is that Mrs. Bennet is far more like eager to get her daughters married off than Mr.
A
Bennet is.
kind way to say it. She is singularly focused.
Yeah, completely
Yeah.
obsessed, right? Um, all the way up to like the really, really sophisticated. Like we have plenty of evidence in this paragraph, in this chapter, to conclude, for instance, that Mr. Bennet originally married Mrs. Bennet because she was hot. In fact, he was a young man of of good fortune, a single young man of good fortune, whom an attractive young local girl threw herself at, and whom he married because she was very attractive, although he clearly did not marry her for her brain, and that he has more or less regretted his decision. We're also like in the incompatibility and the tension between Mr. and Mrs. Bennet. We also potentially see what the consequences are of following the doctrine that was laid out in those first two sentences in the first place.
Yeah, I see that. I never saw it as regret though. It was
Well,
always just like a little bit of eye rolling, you
there's a
know,
lot of
of
eye rolling. Yeah, I don't know. Regret might be strong, but in any case, like the cost is there, right? The cost is he does not have a marriage partner who is his match, right? He is
right.
not happy in his marriage. Exactly. It's not to say that there's no affection there. That's not to say
Yeah.
that like their marriage is a complete disaster, because there are certainly ways in which Mrs. Bennet makes Mr. Bennet a very good wife. But are they a well suited couple? No. Like again, so like we just saw, marrying for money, that's what you're supposed to do. That's what Mr. and Mrs. Bennet did, but look at what can happen, right?
Well, and
If
also
you do
he's
that.
kind of having fun with that at her expense. You know, he's very much a fan of her nerves, but he's going to just play them up and push those buttons. Oh no, you can go visit Mr. Bingley by yourself. You don't need me. Like, you know,
Yes.
it's fine. Obviously, that's going to tick her off because that's not acceptable. And of course, you
No.
can't do that. And, you
No.
know, he knows he's winding her up, but she doesn't know that he knows.
Yeah, exactly. He's winding her
Yeah.
up, but he's not only winding her up, he is being satirical of her in
Yeah.
ways that he knows she's not going to
Gonna
understand,
get.
but
Hmm.
somebody else, like for instance Elizabeth, who is in the room, would get, right? Like
Hmm.
Elizabeth would be, she and Jane probably are both smart enough to understand that he is making fun of her in ways that she doesn't get, right? He's making jokes at her expense for his
Yeah.
daughter's benefit that she doesn't understand, and knowing that she's not going to get it. I mean, that idea, as you say, would be totally inappropriate for her to go and introduce herself to Mr. Bingley without an introduction. Like that
Yeah.
would not be done. So visiting people without an introduction, it was a social faux pas.
Hmm.
But this is what, so the sort of the context of this is that when a man moves into the neighborhood, the moving into the neighborhood is a social excuse for the other men who live in the neighborhood to come and say hello and visit him. And once they visited him, they're now introduced, and their families are introduced. And so now it's okay for their families to visit each other. So he is suggesting what he knows to be socially inappropriate because it's socially inappropriate. Like he's making fun of her desire to sell off their daughters as if they're cattle, right, to this rich young man. And so, so he's teasing her for this, saying, I will send a note by you to say that he has my hearty welcome to marry whichever of my daughters he chooses, right? all he's doing is putting into like plainly crass terms exactly what Mrs. Bennet is trying to do, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. By the way, a couple quick vocabulary things, because this is 18th century vocabulary, and a lot of modern readers don't. When it says Mr. Bennet was a mixture of quick parts, when they talk about somebody being somebody, especially of men, their parts, it means that it's talking about his brain. It's a rather peculiar way, but it's a very typical 18th century expression for his understanding, his intellect. Yeah. And similarly, when she fancies herself nervous, not nervous in the modern sense, nervous in the sense of I have a nervous disorder and like I need to lie down and make a fuss about things.
And that would have been known, nervous meant that, but then he even plays upon that, saying actually it just happened every time she was discontented and didn't get her way. So, even playing on the fact that it wasn't actually a medical condition, it's just, how she reacted when she didn't get what she wanted.
Exactly. Even the word temper is people think about temper about like getting angry, right? But to be of uncertain temper just means very changeable in mood in lots of different directions. Mrs. Bennet doesn't get angry. She gets extravagant, right? But she's quick to change one way or the other. She can snap out of it. She can be all in a tizzy and then snap out of it really quickly too. I'm
smiling like this because I'm picturing the two filmic versions. I'm like, they're both so good.
Yes, they are. I agree. So also notice, of course, how we are introduced during the course of their banter to their relationships with their children. Like, think of what we've learned about their daughters, right? We've learned that Lizzie is her father's favorite.
Yep.
Based on what
we quicker and smarter than the others.
Yeah, he clearly values her for her brains, and so that's the thing that we're told stands out about Lizzie. Jane is the most beautiful. Right, Lizzie is not half so handsome as Jane.
And Lydia's created a party.
Right, good-humored. Yes,
good-humored.
Yes,
life of the party.
Life of the party. Yes, and it's less obvious. It's less obvious from this that Lydia is Mrs. Bennet's favorite. It becomes perfectly clear as the story goes on. From that one sentence, it's not so obvious. It would be more obvious if we knew, which it hasn't been said yet, that there are 5 total daughters. 2 of them don't even get mentioned, Mary and Kitty, in this discussion. In retrospect, though, you can see Lydia's number 5. She's the youngest of the 5 daughters. And the fact that Lizzie and Jane are under discussion and Mrs. Bennet skips over Mary and Kitty, says nothing about them, and goes straight to Lydia, suggests right there that Lydia is her favorite and her focus there. Lydia is absolutely Mrs. Bennet Jr. No question. Like, yes. Oh, she does mention the 5 girls. Thank you, when talking about her own age. But we don't know that Lydia's youngest based on that one reference yet. Anyway, again, I'm just kind of thinking about what we learn. In this first. But again, like, you can build not only a character profile, but a whole family history of the Bennets from this chapter, from this very, very short chapter, which I just read the whole thing of. It's really, really marvelous. Meow asks, what number of Jane Austen's books is this? Number 3, I believe. Again, in the order in which she wrote them. She wrote Northanger Abbey, then Sense and Sensibility, then Pride and Prejudice, if I'm doing that right. So I believe it's, Northanger Abbey, Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice, Mansfield Park, Emma, and then Persuasion. I believe that is the proper sequence. If I learned my lessons.
Was she aware of what her audience's expectations were, do you think? I don't know what her reception was in popular society. Do
She
people
was
know?
popular
What?
pretty quickly. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
She was definitely popular in her own time. Um, uh, does she know her? As far as what her audience expects from her, so this is not her first book. So she has been published before. So it's not, this is not her debut novel. Um, she is, Austen is kind of interesting in the context. I mean, she's very interesting in every context, but she's not, she is both writing into a very well established genre, but also subverting that genre in ways, but not ways that are totally unique. I mean, like satiric novels, like the novels. I mean, it's one of the ironies is that the first novel. Okay, so there were two first novels in English: Robinson Crusoe and Pamela. The third novel in English was a satire of was a parody of one of the first two, and that's Joseph Andrews was a parody of Pamela, which is Joseph Andrews, which is an expansion of the short story called Shamala, which was a direct parody of Pamela, and then gets expanded into full novel length version in Joseph Andrews. But anyway, it's yeah. Oh, excellent, Phil. Thank you. Yes. Sense and Sensibility, 1811. Pride and Prejudice, 19... Hey, look, I did get the order right. Northanger Abbey is published last, but again, it was written first. Yeah. Good, I got the order right. Yeah, I'm... most of... this is me repeating my lessons I learned long ago. This was... reading all 6 of Jane Austen's novels was the condition on which... my reading all 6 of Jane Austen's novels was the condition on which my wife agreed to marry me. So I've I got much instruction on Austen.
An excellent test
for many years. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. Okay. Let's talk about the adaptations.
Yes.
Do you want me to get the visuals up?
No, we can just hang on to them in case we need. I mean, if you haven't seen them, there's 2 YouTube clips that maybe we can pop in a chat. No, there's too many chats to pop into, but you guys can find them.
I think I can do it. I think I can do it.
There's 2 intros that if you haven't seen these, maybe you can just put on low volume because there's not a lot of talking in early and just watch them real quick. They're like 2 minutes each. Just while we talk about them, I just think they're real interesting. They're not crazy different from the text. So like when you watch them, you're very familiar, if you're familiar with the text, of where we are and what we're doing. But the differences that do exist, I think, are pretty striking. So let's talk BBC first. So remember the text, we just jumped straight into saying a man needs a wife and here's the social expectation.
Yeah.
BBC one.
It makes a remarkable first choice, which is to start with Bingley and Darcy.
Yeah.
Riding horses across a field and coming up to Netherfield, seeing Netherfield House, the house that that Mr. Bingley lets, at the beginning of this, and having a conversation between Bingley and Darcy, where Bingley announces that he's gonna rent,
and also that he needed his friend's permission, wanted a second opinion.
We get the dynamics between them and their relationship,
and that dialogue is really revealing as well, because they are saying, yes, it's a fine prospect, but you'll find the country, what do they say, the company a bit, what's the word he uses?
Rough? I can't remember the word.
You'll find a bit crude.
It's not quite so sharp as I can't remember exactly.
Oh. He says something about the country folks. So like, again, you can automatically see something about like class structure and expectation.
And this is a huge thing in 18th and 19th century literature, the English literature, the difference between town and country, right? So you've got like town, London, which is the center of all sophistication and society. And then you've got country living, that is people who live out like the whole rest of England and everything is the country, right, compared to London, which is the town. So
I worked for a producer for years that calls London town still, and it just took me ages to realize, oh, London.
London,
That
right?
is,
Yeah.
that is the one and only capital T town.
Exactly. Yeah. And to say like town versus country is to talk about sophistication versus, backwardness. People who,
Savage.
families, even if they're, you'll find the society something savage, right? Which is, of course, an exaggeration, right? A comic exaggeration between the two friends. But
it also reveals something of Darcy's character, that he's quite judgmental, and
yes,
he is putting a certain amount of prejudice on his buddy before he even moves into the place.
Right. Exactly. Now,
but what's interesting is, sorry, go ahead.
No, you go.
Yeah, it's just, what's so interesting is just leading with the two guys.
Yes.
We're going straight into these two who aren't even in the picture for quite some time, and if they are, it's all in Mrs. Bennet talking about Bingley. But yeah, to have them kind of be front and center, trumpets literally sounding as they ride across a field, it makes it seem like these guys are the main protagonist center of the story. And so setting it up that way,
it is doubly noteworthy because I think, with almost no exceptions, in none of her 6 novels does Jane Austen ever depict, not recall or have somebody tell a story about, but actually depict a scene between 2 men with no women present. That never, ever happens. I don't think there's a single example of a just a straight up narrative depiction of that kind of thing. She always,
Nor do we have that many moments of just a man on his own in a space. Like when we have perspective, it's just of the female. And that's what I just said, the reverse Bechdel test.
The reverse Bechdel test, exactly. Yeah.
200 years before its time. That threw me. I'm like, yep, exactly.
Yeah.
But what I think is interesting about the other half of both of the adaptation intros, we'll talk about the Keira Knightley, Joe Wright one in a minute too, but with both of them, what we see Lizzie doing is the same. And we don't see Lizzie in the text really at all. She's in that room, but we don't really get much of her character. But both of the modern adaptations focus on her independence. She's out for long walks. She's appreciating nature. She's jumping. She's running. She's being a bit thoughtful and silly and reading a book and kind of holding it to her chest. Like, they both have these moments that paint a picture of who Lizzie Bennet is. Right. So we do get that. But also with both of those, we have massive location establishment. Like, the whole purpose is to set the scene, which is also the whole purpose of the text. So in the first couple of pages of the text, we get the scene. We just get it in a very different way.
Yes.
And with the adaptations, the BBC one, I think that's what they were doing with the 2 men. Like, we get the visual geographic location with the establishing shots and Lizzie on a walk and the run and the horseback, but we also get the class introductions with that kind of exchange between Darcy and Bingley. Whereas the Joe Wright one, no talking for a very long time. It's just visuals.
We don't get any. In the whole first 2.5 minutes, we don't get a single word of dialogue.
Which is so Joe Wright anyway. I mean, he's all about beautiful images and minimal dialogue for emotional impact. And it works, it's a style that suits him. So you really do get a sense of the vibe of the family and kind of the energy. And the way it's shot is almost like West Wing, Aaron Sorkin. It's almost like I forget what they call it, the walk and talk. It's almost like the walk and talk, where it's a perpetual motion. And I don't know if you noticed our little trick of left to right. Pretty much everything is left to right in that bit. The only time it's right to left is when she's entering the house. So I thought that was quite interesting, that, it only goes the wrong direction when she's entering the house. And then the camera continues its own tracking as well. So you feel like you are part of the Bennet family, and no talking through that whole thing, just a beautiful soundtrack and lovely lighting, and it just absorbs you into the space. Whereas the BBC one, we're watching it unfold in front of us. We're not part of it, but we're getting a lot of information in a different way.
Absolutely. And the thing, so especially with to me the number one most striking thing is that all male scene at the beginning. And the main effect that I would point to there, just to add on to the things that you're saying here, is the relationship that we are invited to have with the story is quite different from the start, right? Again, the first couple sentences of the book, the single man in possession of a good fortune, is the premise of the plot, right? And the object of interest, but the action is wholly centered in the surrounding families and with their daughters, right? We are being prompted by seeing Bingley and Darcy independently at first. They're our very first impression. As you say, it could, as far as we could tell, this is what the story's just about them. And much of the rest of the story is not going to disappoint us in that, right? They're going to both be very important in the story. But we're prompted from the very beginning to view them equally with the surrounding families and the women. This is not just in the book, the book is totally from the point of view of Elizabeth and Jane. Like, we know what they're thinking. We know what they're feeling. We hear them talking to each other. We're told about what's going on in their minds, right? Whereas Bingley and Darcy are mostly black boxes that they're trying to figure out, and that we are trying to figure. We don't find out for sure what's going. It's only like there will be important moments of revelation when we are told what their their feelings and views actually are, right? But we are left from the perspective of the women and the surrounding families, desperately interpreting, right? What are they thinking? What are they wanting? How are they responding? What conclusions can we draw? And I just think that placing Bingley and Darcy in that opening sequence has a revolutionary impact on our whole perspective on this narrative. It is, in my opinion, a really, really remarkable choice.
Fully agree. Yeah, I mean, bringing these guys in to be a central focus, it's just not what we have expected anywhere else, and it wasn't repeated anywhere else either in any adaptation I can think of Jane Austen, but I haven't seen them all. But especially for the adaptation version that is kind of seen as the adaptation, it's 6 hours long. It's very faithful, authentic. All those words that I say are problematic. It is very close to the text. So it's kind of seen as the bar that everything else is measured by. Plus, it captivated everybody and became like a cult sensation and continued to enamor everyone, for years and years and years. So to have it be such a change that wasn't repeated, I think is also really interesting.
Yeah, exactly. And I will say it's a choice that they make repeatedly throughout the book. And in fact, a number of the most popular moments in that adaptation are some of these added scenes. Of course, I'm thinking in particular of the famous Mr. Darcy takes his shirt off and dives into the pond scene.
Which is the main reason the thing is known anywhere. Right? And then people watch it and fall in love with him. But
exactly. I mean, that's but that moment, right? They've added this iconic and symbolic moment, but it's one in which we, the viewers, are being shown an interiority on Darcy's own life and thought that is we're nowhere close to that ever. Another scene, which is, sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say, and same in the Joe Wright one, when he's helping Keira Knightley get into the carriage after visiting Pemberley, and their hands touch for a hot second, and both of them like flex their hands, and you see Darcy get like visibly like he felt the spark. Like we don't get to see that in the text. To see him like actually have an emotional reaction and response to a physicality, like ooh, again, that's why things work so well in a visual medium. Like I don't necessarily want or need pages and pages on screen to draw out when something like a handhold, and that also kind of reflects back to your own shared experience that most people in the audience will know the value of a touched hand and how
Right.
exciting that can be. So like seeing that between these two characters and having it be so G-rated is just lovely and very absorbing.
Yes. Yes. And it's, um, again, that is a really classic example also. Does that, is that true to the text? 100%. It's true to the
Yeah.
text, right? It is clear to me as the day is long that the number one initial and primary reason that Mr. Darcy falls in love with Lizzie is that he finds her completely sexy. Like it is a like a hot physical reaction that he has to her. Like that clearly. I mean, there's no question in my mind that it is.
I'd like to think there's a little bit about her
There's
brain in
more.
there.
I'm not saying no,
Yeah.
I'm not saying it doesn't
Okay.
enter into it. I'm saying that's
Oh
where
yeah.
it starts. That's where
He
it
is
starts.
taken. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
And
What
they're
does what does
representing
he say?
something that's clearly there.
And he says, you know, she's fairly tolerable, but that's also the societal expectation. Like he hasn't had a moment to actually be impressed by her wit or her knowledge. Like that's not
Yes.
acceptable for him to just go chat with her about their latest favorite book. Like
Yes.
he can only judge her on appearance and
Yep.
maybe family.
Yep.
Family's not going to do her any favors in this situation, so he's just going to
No.
focus on
Not at all.
attraction. Yeah.
Not at all. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, there's a very physical attraction between both of them, though Lizzie doesn't want to admit it either.
Mm-hmm.
And that itself is one of the things that's really interesting. I mean, that
Yeah.
it's interesting because I find this person physically attractive is one of the other really important elements in this whole love and marriage equation, right? And yet it keeps, that's the thing that like you really kind of dare not name, right? And isn't supposed to come in. But we see from whether it was Mr. Bennett for Mrs. Bennett, which was clearly like about 98% of that, no, 100% of that, or whether it's, you know, whether it's like Mr. Wickham, who is obviously like enormously sexy and charismatic. Again, like his physical attractiveness is clearly almost overwhelming.
Magnetic.
Yeah, he's a completely magnetic person.
To the point that like you can't help but compare him to some sort of like Neil Gaiman Greek god type character. Like it just seems to really like draw you in. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And Wickham's a fascinating character because it's one of those where like the more times you read the book, the more times you're like, how does he not come across as scuzzy from day one? Like on rereading, every time you reread it, he seems scuzzier earlier, right? And yet when you first meet him, every woman is helpless when they first meet Mr. Wickham. Because anyway, no, there's a lot
He's
there.
what's called a playa.
Yeah, he is completely a player, 100%. But
and Phil, I kind of agree. These days people would be rushing to diagnose what kind of neurodivergence Darcy is, and I really feel like that is how it's played. I don't know if that's purposeful or not, but you certainly see that element of Darcy that he's so blunt, he's so direct that it's part of his character, and those that love him kind of respect him for that directness.
Yeah,
but you see how that comes off as incredibly rude.
Yeah. And that he is shy, he is explicitly open about. I mean, he confesses this later on. Yeah, this was, he's, and again, this is, it's the amazing thing about the book, right? Is that Austen is always placing us in the position of having to interpret. Right. One of the things that makes Pride and Prejudice such a work of genius is, you know, people talk about like writers who show things instead of just telling them, right? What Jane Austen does is tell us things and that will lead us to draw certain conclusions, tell us and show us things that will lead us to draw certain conclusions, but which then we will be made to question later on. We're
Yeah.
always,
Yeah.
it's, I mean, and this is exactly the situation. I mean, that very circumstance of the acts of interpretation that we're having to do, and of assessment and reassessment of people and their characters and their intentions, it is so true to actual human experience. You know, the number of times you're like, what did she mean when she said this? Or like, it
Yeah.
could have meant this, it could have meant that. Like, what is she really thinking? Like, she said this,
Yeah.
but what does she really think? And you know.
And those exchanges between Darcy and Lizzie when they're talking about Jane, that's where I think one of the places you see it most clearly.
Yes.
Because Bingley and Jane obviously get together and have, a nice little flirtation, and Darcy breaks it up because he doesn't think that Jane actually likes Bingley. So he
Right.
goes through this whole rigmarole of like, she didn't seem that interested. I told my friend he didn't seem that interested. She
And he
didn't seem
wasn't
it.
wrong.
And
He wasn't. I mean, he was wrong.
yeah,
He was not. But like, his interpretation was a
his
totally
interpretation
plausible interpretation. Yeah.
is
Yeah.
understandable, but instead of asking, he just dictated. So
Yes.
like there's no communication, there's just presumption.
Yeah.
And then they act on that, and then it's just this backpedaling of like, but wait, you don't know her. And so again, it's very much like why I think this literature persists so well, because we can all relate to that. I thought you meant this. No, I didn't mean that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. By the way, on the subject of Darcy's physical attraction for Lizzie, my favorite line in the whole book is when he's watching Elizabeth from a distance, and Miss Bingley comes up to him and says, "I can imagine what you're thinking right now," and he says, "I
Yeah,
would
sure.
imagine not."
Yeah, I was gonna say, I assure you, you don't, you can. Yeah.
That's so good. It is so good. I should imagine not.
Which I don't think that line made it. I don't think that made it into either adaptation, did
No, I
it?
don't think it does.
I
I don't
don't
think
think
it
it
does.
did.
It might have done into the BBC. It might have. I can't remember for sure. But
Yeah,
oh man,
just
I
check.
love that line. Um, anyway, yeah, but now coming back to, this is one of the things that makes Pride and Prejudice such an interesting example in comparing film adaptation and book adaptation, right?
Hmm.
Because, the like book version and film version, I mean, because when, for one thing, as a writer, you are much more in control of the point of view than in a film, right? Like, a writer can is in more absolute control of what data
To
the
see.
reader has to notice, right? And the film can control those and can manipulate those in some very interesting ways, but the relationship isn't the same, right?
The same way we were just talking, perceptions can be drawn based on the viewer's own experiences and understanding of things. So, if you show me a dark cave, I might see that as really exciting and kind of intriguing. Somebody else might see it as the terror place of doom. So
Right.
expectations.
Yeah, and there are ways that so the filmmaker can choose to through the soundtrack cue you in a particular direction, right? So
Yep.
let's play fun adventurous music instead of horror music, and that'll help get you in the right frame of mind for taking in what you're taking in. So again, there are things that can be done, but again, like the writer can depict a conversation and tell you very selective things, even if they're giving you, you feel like you're getting the whole picture. They don't have to tell you facial expressions. They don't have to tell you, describe body language. They don't have to. They can slant things by particular word choices that are, again, not just even within the dialogue itself, but in the context of the dialogue. Yes, there are lots of ways, again, in which the point of view can be managed, and the information that the reader has can be managed much more directly. Whereas, again, in a film, if you're watching two people have a conversation, you have to provide all these, to some extent, you have to provide them all these things.
Yeah.
Not only the words, but the tone of voice, the facial expressions, the body language.
The room that they're in, what they're wearing,
Yes.
is it morning, is it night, is it raining, is it sunny? Like, and I remember one of my first film classes, nothing in a scene is an accident. So like absolutely everything in a scene is chosen for purpose. And
Yes.
sometimes, some things have more purpose than another, but they're literally looking at seven lamps on a table to see which one works best because
Yes.
it's going to give a certain emotion or let off a certain light that can affect how somebody looks, rather sharp light or soft
Right.
light.
Right.
So
Right.
nothing in a shot is an accident. Like everything in there is going to give you some sort of idea of what the purpose of that moment is and who these characters are. So it's quite fun if you ever do pause one of your favorite films and just pick apart a single scene. I love looking at people's bedrooms, like how did they decorate the walls and what's on the
Right.
floor. Somebody had to set that up. Like none of it is an accident.
Right. Right. It
Yeah.
is. And I do think that people still underestimate how exactly how much thought goes into every single detail.
And how effective that is. Like, I feel like you are so immediately drawn out of a story when something isn't right in that scene. So, when people find a car in the background is the obvious example. It's some period drama and they see a car in the background of a shot that wasn't edited out and you're like, sure, there's that. But I also think there's things where like a room can look like it's two staged. Oh, it looks
Mm-hmm.
like they've decorated this to look like a parlor from 1813 rather than it
Right.
being a parlor that they live in 1813.
Right.
It's a fine line, but there is a big difference.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. Let's Can I pull in the visuals for a second?
Yeah, please.
Okay. I want to look at the way we're presented. So, thinking of these things, thinking about the tools that they have for themselves here, right? I want to look at the way the Bennett family is presented in both of these two films because we get the Bennett family presented through dialogue in the book, right? Um, and on the one hand, you would think, or one might possibly think, right, that this is the this is the most obvious. I mean, like, this is really snappy dialogue. You could easily do this in a movie, right? But they don't. Neither of them choose to start with this. We
Right.
get a version of this dialogue in both of the films, but neither of them uses this as an opening in the way that Austen just jumps in without even introducing the characters. Right? She introduces the characters through this dialogue. So okay, so I'm just gonna look here. This is the Pride and Prejudice one. The Pride and Prejudice one. This is the BBC one. Okay, so I'm not gonna play it. I'm gonna like go through it. So here's because I don't want to take too much time. So here's Bingley and Darcy coming up as we said. I want to get past this to the Bennets. Okay, so we start here with Elizabeth, like a portrait of her face is where we start, and then because she's seeing them, right?
Mm-hmm. She's watching.
She's watching them from a distance. I'm not doing the music. Now she walks around and we see her strolling slowly down the hill. So we have her out walking, right? We get the countryside. So this is
Location
definitely,
established.
yeah, location established. Country. We get
Skip
her now running downhill, right? So we have this, and now picking flowers. So there's this sort of freedom of her. We get we're in a sort of farm setting. We get horses and a wooden fence, right? And she's clearly very comfortable and familiar here. Now we're getting the house. Come around the corner. Okay, there's Longbourn House.
And if you do hear the soundtrack, it's just natter, 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 screaming, screaming, screaming.
Oh, yes, her sister's screaming. Yes,
Yeah.
This is Kitty and Lydia arguing inside. She stops at the window. Here's Mr. Bennet, her father, reading a book in his study, and she pauses right outside the window. He looks up and sees her, rolls his eyes at the sound. She rolls her eyes back and they share, so we can see. Notice how they just accomplished one of the things that Austen accomplished in the dialogue, right? The connection between Lizzie and her dad, how both of them understand things and understand each other, and both of them kind of distance themselves from the younger sisters, which we now see fighting and running around. There's Mrs. Bennet complaining about her nerves. We see Mrs. Bennet's favoritism for Lydia right away because she immediately decides in favor of Lydia, and Lydia, who has stolen Kitty's bonnet and Mrs. Bennet, and Kitty's trying to make her take it back. Anyway, and now we finally get Jane.
Completely separate from the chaos.
Yeah,
joining
separate
up
from the chaos, right? Yeah, the joining up, the two of them together, standing shoulder to shoulder, right? So that
there's established, and then there's Mary, just not
Mary sitting off by herself, not
and
saying or doing anything, and nobody paying attention to her. Yeah,
and the only one wearing that, like, you know, very prim, proper long sleeve button up situation.
Yeah. So we get them walking home from church,
getting the gossip.
Yeah, Mr. Bennet out in front looking like he's trying to outpace them all. Mrs. Bennet literally running to catch up with him and try to keep up with him. And this is where we get the beginning of the dialogue, the parallel dialogue, though it happens
where he
in
never
motion.
He never makes eye contact with her. Just, yes, tell me.
Right, exactly. He never makes eye contact. Okay, so we learn a bunch of things about the Bennet family here. We can see many of the dynamics that they have prompted us to, and they do. We get some dialogue, like between Mrs. Bennet and Kitty and Lydia, but much of it is done without dialogue. What are some like adjectives with which we would describe like the Bennets and their household? It would be, well, chaotic. Chaotic is inside the house, though sharply contrasted with the peacefulness outside, right? Especially when Elizabeth was up on the hilltop and during her walking, skipping, running, picking flowers on the way down.
It shows you why she likes that too. It just gives her that separation from the chaos. So she's not other. She's not, you know, Mary. She does participate, but she appreciates the peace and serenity. But yeah, and you can tell they're well off. I mean, things are nice, but they're not flashy. I do think they're depicted as more poor in the films than in the text. Do you agree?
I think so, though we've clearly been shown the two houses, Longbourn and Netherfield, in this version. And it's very clear that Netherfield is much larger than Longbourn is. But Longbourn is also clearly a big house, you know, with the columned entry and everything, and the big driveway that comes out in front of it and everything. So they are positioned as of the like gentleman class, right? Of the they are landed gentry,
right? But with minimal income,
but with less income, certainly, than the Netherfield folks.
And they give us those numbers quite early on too, don't they? We get 4,000 to 5,000 a year for Bingley, and she said, "Well, who would have me for 50 a year?" So we already know.
Lizzie has no money.
Worth, yeah.
Lizzie has no money, and even when we learn in the book, in the book, again, it's easier to do exposition in books as well, to explain about how Mr. Bennet has 2,000 a year. His property is worth 2,000 a year, but he actually is half as rich as Bingley, but his property is entailed and he can't leave it to his daughters and he can't give it away. So his daughters don't have a significant marriage portion. Yes, Nameless Arcanum, you're right. They are all, they're definitely landed gentry class, the whole group of them. We don't see the daughters doing work. I agree. Okay, let's look at.
All right.
Let's look at the other one. Okay, sorry. Bringing that over. Okay. Yeah, make it a little bigger. Okay. All right. So, in the Keira Knightley one, we just get landscape. A beautiful sunrise over the trees. It's still A beautiful sunrise. Oh, the sun is rising a little bit more. That is the action so far, is the sun is now higher over the trees than it was before.
Just the pace that it's setting, though, like the titles come up
Exactly.
really slow. The music is very chill and quiet. Oh, we're just revealing that title. Like,
Uh-huh.
it's a shorter film, but it doesn't feel rushed because it's really setting this pace.
We had over 45 seconds in which the camera did not move. It starts with that landscape shot and then doesn't move for 45. And then we get Elizabeth again. So once again, we get a head and shoulders shot of Elizabeth, this time again outside, this time reading. Right? So we're getting sort of the two things about her. We're getting bookishness, we're getting, intellect, as well as the walking outside.
Yeah, the solitude. And they're really engaging with the text. Like she's reacting to it, and then
Mm-hmm.
this little stroke of the cover.
Yeah. Now we see once again farm stuff. Look, there are cows wandering around in the background. She's walking on this little like bridge thing across the pond. We see laundry outside. So we see the house over here on the right, and the first thing we see is the laundry hanging up outside.
Very domestic. But also I love this like little bridge she's walking. I don't know if there's an importance to it, but you can't help but feel it's like a slightly precarious
Yes.
instance that she confidently traverses. Like if you want to read a film, you could read into that and be like, it is a narrow path she is treading, but she's doing it well.
She could fall to either side. But not only does she, as you say, does she make it, but she makes it with confidence. Like this is part of her routine. Her routine.
She could probably be reading that book and still do it, you know?
Exactly. Yeah. She comes in amongst the laundry. We see people working in the background, probably servants, though one of them might not be. The one standing with the bonnet on is clearly a servant. Is that one of her sisters sitting down?
Might be.
I think it may be. Yeah. I don't know if she's butchering, but she's doing something. It looked like some kind of laundry work, I think.
And watch the camera work from here in too.
Oh yeah, she passes by the door, and now we stop. We leave Elizabeth and go in.
And we enter into the house.
Oh, there's Jane. So once again, we've got Lydia and Kitty running around. That would be Mary at the pianoforte.
Soft light, warm.
The big dog. The dog is a feature of this film. If we just had this shot, I keep pausing it, but if we just had this shot of the table with the bonnet and the fancy chairs and the like, this, on the one hand, looks refined, right? But
lived in,
cluttered, very lived in, right? But this looks like a really sharp. We came in the back door, right? The film brings us in the back door through the laundry and the.
We're part of the family, you know, and that's what I mean about like a scene being too set. If somebody said, give me a Regency era dining room, you'd have really, really fancy, prim and proper. This has like clothes thrown over the back of a chair, which is what any of us would do, and just leftovers strewn on the table because they haven't been cleared yet. And yeah, very lived in.
Yes. Yeah, and I agree, Phil. I think we've accounted for all the sisters, so I think that was not a sister in the back. But we couldn't tell. We couldn't tell originally. Like, and there's like the guy feeding the ducks, or they're geese, I think. And then now here comes Elizabeth back around the front. And here she comes in the house from right to left.
But we get that moment away from her to kind of swoop through the home, reconnect with her, and then she'll take us inside via this conversation.
Right, there's Mr. and Mrs. Bennet. The shift from light to dark. The beautiful glowing light outdoors, right? This glowing golden light here right before, while she's still outside on the front porch, and then she goes in and it's really dark, like
really dark.
right away. It's
Can you
that.
take it back another couple seconds? It actually darkens outside before she walks in, doesn't it?
Let's see.
There's almost like a
Yeah,
fade to
it
black
does almost there. Yeah, and then of course as we go through the wall,
there.
um,
Yeah.
we get it. Yeah. Okay. So no dialogue in that whole first 2.5 minutes of the film at all. Um, so um, okay. The Bennett family is far more rustic in the Keira Knightley version. This is one of the things that I will admit it kind of bothered my wife when we saw that film the first time. She thought that they were making the Bennetts look too poor.
Yeah, and you saw that in a lot of the reaction articles that they were
Mm-hmm.
poorer, but they were more fun.
Right, right. Um, yeah. Okay. So anyway, it's such a fascinating opening, but I think again, in ways, the opening, especially of that one. What'd you say the director was? Joe Knight.
Joe Wright.
Joe Wright. Yeah.
He did Atonement and oh, what's that other big one? I'll think of it. Keep going.
Okay. Um, the Joe Wright version, um, even much more so than the BBC version. Comparing the opening of that film with the opening of the text it's like a spotlight on what you can do in books compared to what you can do on film, right? I mean, Joe Wright is leaning very, very heavily into like the tools at his disposal as a, visual, artist here, right? With what he's putting on. It's almost extravagant in the way that, Austen introduces everything through immediate dialogue. This exchange, which we overhear and we learn everything, we can figure out everything from reading. And Wright says, nope, I'm just going to pan the camera around and show you things, and you'll be able to draw conclusions about that. And we could go through, we're running out of time. No, we have run out of time, but we could go through and like we were doing with the book and talking about all the different things, all the different conclusions we can draw and all the things we can learn about the characters and the world, we could do the same thing from that opening. Mm-hmm. All the things that we learn about from all those different camera shots. And it's a remarkable study in what you can do in the different ways.
And I feel like it took us a long time to get to this statement, but like that's another thing I love about adaptation is there's so many ways to tell a story.
Yes.
Like we don't have to go straight into dialogue. We can spend multiple minutes with just pretty music and low lighting and walking. And by the end of that 2-3 minutes, we know a lot about what's happening in this world and who we're dealing with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Namus Arcanum is asking, do we think the openings are so much more focused on physical setting because they're period pieces for us as a modern audience versus being contemporary to the reader like the book was? I think it does kind of benefit us in some ways, but it's certainly, there's no sense in which the focus on setting, which both of them do a lot of non-dialogue establishing shot. I mean, establishing shot after establishing shot, right, in those. But it's not just. It is doing a lot. It is conveying a lot, and again, it's conveying a lot of the same things.
And
where go ahead.
No, go ahead.
So I was going to say in the BBC version, like the moment with the Lizzie and Mr. Bennett eye contact and eye roll, right? There we can see them setting out to like identifying things that Jane Austen accomplishes in that initial dialogue and setting out to accomplish those same things using the different visual tools, right? In the the Joe Wright version, I don't think that we can see exactly that same thing. I don't think that we see him. At least I don't get the kind of the direct connection back to the very things that are being emphasized in the conversation between Mr. and Mrs. Bennet in chapter 1. It doesn't correlate so directly.
So directly. Yeah.
And yet he is still established. He is still doing the same kind of work. We are of world building and character building and establishment of perspective and sort of the framing of the story, right?
But he does so much more of that through camera angles and through lighting and through music that, there's multiple moments in the Joe Wright version where something emotional happens and the camera goes from here to here in seconds. That so rarely happens in period drama because they want to just kind of keep the establishing shot or the mid shots. So to have, when Bingley comes back in for the second attempt at the proposal, it goes like zoom straight to the face, like, oh my God, he's here,
Yes.
And to have that, it's so much more effective because we're not prepared for it. We don't think it's going to happen. That's a single camera shot, that's just a technical thing that is able to tell a story.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that really interests me about the Joe Wright version is we have no sense of what the story is. We're getting world building, we're getting characters, but we don't get plot at all.
And that's something I was going to say earlier, it's worth remembering what the purpose of openings is. And there isn't a clear answer to that. For some storytellers, I'm making a real good face in this frozen shot. For some storytellers, it's establishing and plot development. It's laying a foundation so you understand where we are, like we saw in The Hobbit and Fellowship. Laying that foundation, giving the prologue, giving the backstory to make sure when we enter day one, we know exactly what's going on. With others, it's shock and mystery. So, we've certainly had films where it starts with a car crash and then it's like 10 days earlier and we have to kind of figure out how they get to that point. That's a different method to draw you in. With Joe Wright, it feels kind of like that vibe. Like, I'm not going to tell you. I'm just going to show you this day in the life, slice of life situation. But you'll be able to infer the things that are important to these people and start to draw that out. But yeah, I think that's just down to different storytelling techniques. They're all doing the same thing, and I think they're all doing it well. I think the adaptations are great, and they're very different, and that's awesome.
Yeah. I mean, so the lack of plot context, right? But Austen puts it out there in those first two sentences. Again, like we know what the issue is in this story, right? Before we hear anybody start talking. In the BBC version, they establish that by showing the men. So we establish that Bingley, who's obviously rich, is coming into town, and then we see Elizabeth seeking them, right? And then her going back to the house. So this is obviously so we are introduced to Elizabeth, visually introduced to Elizabeth and her family and her home in the context of a rich guy just moved in next door. So it less forcefully announces the sort of marriage theme of the of the story than the book does, but we still sort of see where the lines of drama are likely to be in some way or other, right? Whereas again, we're given none of that at all, and I think about the kind of ways in which it changes. As I was suggesting about the introduction to the men in the BBC version, how it changes our frame of reference, right? If the BBC version pushes us to be kind of more objective, to look at both sides, like we're sort of equally interested in Darcy and Elizabeth in a sense, right? At least much more so in the BBC version than in the book, which is 100% from Elizabeth's point of view, and Mr. Darcy's a mystery. The Joe Wright film is totally in the other direction. We get just Elizabeth and her family. We don't even know that there are any men in the picture, and have no way of even guessing at that from the beginning. Now it is interesting, Ms. Manrique, that you can see that pointing out the separation between Elizabeth and her family, right? And that's something that gets emphasized in both of the first two, right? That is, sorry, both of the film versions emphasize the distance between Elizabeth and her family, that she is solitary, that she's looking at them from a distance. She is coming and like joining them or rejoining them, and they are clearly her context, but both of them have her coming from well outside the house and then returning to the house. So anyway, that's well, there's lots more that we could say, but
I know, I'm like, we barely touched this one. Next week might be a little more Pride and Prejudice. We'll see.
Yeah. Do you want to do another Jane Austen opening? Like, do you want to do an Emma opening, say?
Or Sense and Sensibility. God, I love that one. We can do either. There's only the one Sense and Sensibility.
That's what I was thinking, yeah.
Oh, no, there's the BBC one. There's a BBC one.
We could get the BBC one. Okay.
Well, let's do both, Corey.
Why choose?
We get to decide this, right? You guys are fine with it.
You don't mind if we have 4 or 5 Jane Austen
Let's
book
just
discussions?
call it Jane Austen. I was going to say we should call it Jane Austen Month, but I was also thinking we should probably do something Halloween-y, just because that would be fun. I don't know what the answer to that is yet, but...
And also we may be interrupting our schedule to talk to the Return to Moria folks at some point. So,
and then it's Christmas, and we have to do something Christmassy. So you know what? Yeah. So do we want to just pick something for next week, though, so we can assign homework?
Yeah, let's assign homework. So do you want? So we can do Sense and Sensibility if you like.
Oh, I don't mind either one.
Okay, let's do Sense and Sensibility then.
I know it way better than Emma, but I'm happy to do both.
Okay, let's do Sense and Sensibility then.
Okay.
The Emma one would be a little bit interesting because it was just that relatively recent Emma.
Yeah. Oh, that was really good.
Yeah. So I was thinking we could maybe do that one and maybe the Gwyneth Paltrow or something.
Gwyneth Paltrow one.
So we could do the Gwyneth Paltrow and the recent one and the book.
I'm with Madagot and Clueless.
And Clueless. Yeah,
and
totally.
Clueless.
100%. 100%. Clueless, one of my
excellent adaptation.
Oh, phenomenal adaptation. I mean, Clueless has to be on my short list of favorite.
And we could have brought Bridget Jones into the conversation with Pride and Prejudice too. So yes. I think touching into these modern adaptations of Jane Austen is really fun.
Bridget Jones is tough because then we'd have to bring in both book and film, basically.
True.
Whereas with Clueless, at least we just have it's another film adaptation with still the same central. Because we have to think about the relationship between the Bridget Jones book and the and Pride and Prejudice book, as well as the film's relationship to those books and to each other. As of course they cast Colin Firth as the Darcy character in both. Darcy in both. So
he must have loved.
Oh man, it's All
right, so next week is Sense and Sensibility. We're gonna do the Emma Thompson one and the BBC one.
Yes.
Yeah? Okay.
Yes. Sense and Sensibility next time.
And same kind of rules, opening bit. Everybody can kind of decide what that is. It's not like the first chapter. It's like the first thing that establishes our entry.
Yeah. Though Austen's chapters are pretty short, so.
True. Yeah. Fun. All right.
Cool.
Well, we made up for being a little bit late.
Yeah, exactly. Stayed over a little bit late too. Excellent. Very good. So Sense and Sensibility next time. First chapter of the book or so, and then those 2 films, the BBC and the Emma Thompson. And
know that we're planning on Emma in the near future, if it's not the following week. Sounds good.
Excellent. All right. Awesome. Very good. Thanks everybody for joining us, and we will see. I've got so many windows open I can't even find where I can close down the stream. Okay. All right. Thanks very much, everybody.
Night.
Have a good evening, Merlin. Merlin's already asleep, so we're good.
He's already up. See you guys.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye.